At the start of the 20th century, African Americans possessed a minimum of 14 million acres of land. However, by the 21st century, nearly 90% of this land had been forcibly taken from them. Presently, African Americans own only 1.1 million acres of farmland, and have partial ownership of an additional 1.07 million acres. Over the course of the century, white farmers and landowners employed various methods to dispossess African Americans of their land. These methods included violence, heirs property, tax sales, and the Torrance Acts. The Heirs Property Act, one of these mechanisms, remains in effect today, contributing to the ongoing loss of wealth that African Americans have accumulated over generations. To comprehend the enormity of this land theft, it is essential to examine the extreme measures employed to seize land from African American landowners. Throughout history, both legal statutes and unethical practices enabled white landowners, farmers, and developers to manipulate the system, ultimately gaining control over land owned by African American farmers and homeowners. In this video, we will explore 4 ways in which African Americans were dispossessed of their land and how these injustices persist today. Violence. As African Americans became more prosperous and property owners following the Civil War, white individuals harboring jealousy and upholding white supremacy resorted to violence and lethal force. Between 1865 and 1965, the Tuskegee Institute and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People documented over 3,000 lynchings, with many victims being landowners. Lynchings were used to terrorize African Americans, destroy black wealth, and enforce white supremacy. These acts were not solely committed by ordinary citizens, but sometimes involved the condonation of violence by white officials. Heirs property. African American landowners were often pressured, sometimes by authorities, to relinquish their land and leave. Lynchings, mob attacks, and threats forced many to abandon their property or sell it at significantly reduced prices. Entire black communities became refugees within their own country. For example, after a 1920 Election Day attack on the black community in Ocoee, Florida, 18 black families lost a total of 330 acres and 48 city lots as they were forced to flee. Tax sales. African American landowners were sometimes put under immense pressure to give up their land through legal mechanisms such as tax sales. For instance, in Pierce City, Missouri, a predominantly black tobacco center faced attacks by white marauders. Within days, all 129 black residents had fled, and their land was sold at bargain prices to white individuals. Torrance Acts. Bands of white farmers, known as the White Caps, used threats and violence to drive African Americans from their land. They nailed notes with crude drawings of coffins to the doors of black landowners, warning them to leave or face death. These historical injustices, perpetuated by both laws and practices, have had long-lasting consequences. African Americans were forced into an exodus from their land, becoming refugees in their own country, and often selling their property at far lower prices than their worth. Today, these losses continue to affect African American communities, contributing to the racial wealth gap and ongoing disparities in land ownership. One of the most brutal instances of racial violence targeting African American landowners was the tragic story of Anthony Crawford. Crawford, a wealthy African American, inherited fertile land from his father upon his passing. He further expanded his land holdings through substantial purchases in 1883, 1888, 1899, and 1903. During the mid to late 1890s, Crawford was a co-founder of the Industrial Union of Abbeville County, an organization dedicated to advancing the material, moral, and intellectual well-being of the black community. He was also the father of 12 sons and 4 daughters. Crawford undeniably stood as one of the most affluent individuals in Abbeville County. However, his success posed a threat to the prevailing white supremacy, as there were clearly defined limitations that African Americans were not expected to surpass during that era. For many decades, prosperous African Americans lived with the constant apprehension that their white neighbors could resort to violence at any moment, confiscating everything they had accumulated. This grim day arrived for Crawford on October 21, 1916. Crawford was transporting 2 loads of cotton and a load of seed into Abbeville, when a dispute over the price of cottonseed with W.D. Barksdale, a white store owner, escalated. Barksdale offered Crawford 85 cents a pound for his cottonseed, to which Crawford responded by claiming he had a better offer. In response, Barksdale called him a liar, and Crawford labeled the storekeeper a cheat. Subsequently, 3 clerks in the store grabbed axe handles, and Crawford retreated into the street. Sheriff Burtz appeared on the scene and arrested Crawford for verbally insulting a white man. Crawford was briefly held at the jail but was released later in the day after posting bail of $1.15. While Crawford was making arrangements for his bail, Barksdale was organizing a mob with a man named McKinney to physically assault Crawford, ostensibly to teach him a lesson. Sheriff Burtz reluctantly allowed Crawford to exit through a side door, but the mob spotted him and pursued him into a nearby cotton mill. There, Crawford sought refuge in the boiler room. McKinney entered the boiler room after Crawford, who, grabbing a hammer from nearby tools, knocked McKinney unconscious. Despite efforts by mill workers to intervene, Crawford was savagely attacked and stabbed by the mob. Sheriff Burtz reappeared, arrested Crawford once more, much to the displeasure of the white mob. To secure Crawford away from the enraged mob, Sheriff Burtz had to promise McKinney's brothers that he wouldn't attempt to sneak Crawford out of town before the extent of McKinney's injuries became clear. It turned out that McKinney was not seriously harmed, while Crawford was severely injured. A physician named C.E.C.E. Gamble, who also served as the mayor of Abbeville, attended to Crawford. Gamble announced that Crawford would likely succumb to his wounds. Concerned that Crawford might die before they could enact their vengeance, and suspicious that the sheriff might facilitate Crawford's escape, around 200 white men surrounded the jail at 3 p.m. They captured and disarmed Sheriff Burtz and abducted Crawford. Crawford was dragged down 3 flights of stairs amidst the cheers of the bloodthirsty mob. They subjected him to a brutal assault, involving rocks, wagon boards, jumping on him, and spitting on his battered body. The mob then hanged Crawford from a tree with a rope around his neck as a warning. Subsequently, they commandeered a lumber wagon from a black driver to transport Crawford to a nearby fairground. By this point, Crawford was likely already deceased, but the mob continued to brutalize his body, riddling it with bullets until it was a grotesque, bloodied mass. The newspapers reported the following day, with headlines reading, "Negro strung up and shot to pieces in an attempt to conceal the truth." The county coroner reported that Crawford had died at the hands of unidentified parties. That night, the relentless mob decided to expel the remaining Crawford family members from the area. On October 23, 1916, the white citizens of Abbeville, including many who had participated in the lynching, voted to expel the remainder of the Crawford family from South Carolina and seize their substantial property holdings. They also decided to close down all black-owned businesses in Abbeville. The Crawfords requested time until November 15 to leave, and this request was granted. They departed by mid-November, leaving behind their families' assets accumulated over generations. Method 2. Tax sales. Another method employed to deprive African Americans of their land was through tax sales. Tax sales offered a means to take land from its owners and sell it off. White tax assessors frequently overvalued land owned by African Americans, leading to a heavier tax burden for black property owners and slowly eroding their earnings. If black-owned property became valuable or a black property owner challenged white supremacy, local officials could simply declare the property tax delinquent and auction it off. Black property owners, often living on fixed incomes, struggled to pay annual property taxes, eventually leading to defaults. When properties fell into default, the county would put them up for auction. Developers capitalized on this situation, especially when families were unwilling to sell their land. Evelina Jenkins, a black South Carolina Sea Islands native, provides a prime example. She owned numerous acres of property, including an entire island. However, she lacked formal education, which, combined with racial discrimination and a lack of access to fair government services, left her vulnerable. A white neighbor, whom she trusted, was entrusted with taking her annual property tax payments to town but instead pocketed the money. When her taxes fell delinquent, he purchased the lien to her property at the county's tax auction, and after the redemption period expired, he gained title to her land, including the island. He subsequently sold it to a developer. While land values along the state's coastline surged in the early 1970s, Miss Jenkins, the rightful owner, saw none of the wealth generated from her property, eventually passing away penniless. Method 3. Torrens Act. The third method, the Torrens Act, drew from the Torrens system initially used in Australia in 1858. It was devised by Sir Robert Torrens to enhance the certainty of land title and simplify land transactions. When introduced in the United States, the Torrens Act was intended to streamline title registration, but evolved into a loophole exploited by third parties to forcibly dispossess families of their property through partition sales. Partition sales occur when one property owner wishes to sell, but others do not. Under the Torrens Act and related regulations, sales could take place without notifying other family members or co-owners. Once the sale was completed, the rules surrounding the Torrens Act shielded the buyer from legal recourse by unaware or dissenting property owners. This legal maneuver allowed third parties to take control of property without the knowledge or consent of other family members, particularly when family communication was lacking or when some members could not be located. Developers seized this opportunity in booming real estate markets, buying valuable property at a fraction of its actual worth through partition sales. Method 4. Heirs property. The fourth method, heirs property, was consistently used across various states, each with its own approach to dispossessing African Americans of their land. Heirs property generally refers to land owned by multiple generations without the formal legal processes required to prove ownership, through probate proceedings upon an owner's death. While heirs might possess the property, they lack the clear title necessary to verify their ownership. This limitation meant they couldn't sell the property, use it as collateral, or receive USDA benefits for farming activities. It also exposed them to greater risks of losing the property through partition actions or for failing to pay property taxes. Over generations, the number of owners would multiply significantly, complicating the matter of acquiring permission for land transactions. As a result, it became easy for outsiders to exploit family miscommunication and gain control of the land. Partition sales resulting from heirs property usually led to the property being sold at well below market prices, benefiting the buyers while leaving dispossessed family members with nothing. The cumulative impact of these methods, employed over a century to expropriate land, was devastating. In Mississippi alone, the land stolen between 1950 and 1964 amounted to around 800,000 acres. Researchers have estimated the value of this stolen land in Mississippi to be between $3.7 billion and $6.6 billion in today's dollars. These estimates of white wealth accumulation through land theft represent just one state's perspective. Presently, only 43.4% of Black Americans own homes compared to 72.1% of white individuals, exacerbating the racial wealth divide. Black land theft demonstrates that African Americans' economic progress has been consistently hampered, not due to a lack of effort on their part, but because they have faced systematic obstacles at every turn. This history should compel us to ask questions about the cumulative impact of thousands of small financial transactions over decades. In a nation founded on slavery, it's crucial to recognize that overlooking these issues can leave us vulnerable to future wealth extraction schemes. While black land theft may not be as blatant today, new wealth extraction methods have emerged, emphasizing the necessity of seeking answers to these questions. In a country where the typical white family possesses 8 times the wealth of the typical black family, addressing the racial wealth divide becomes paramount. Black land theft persisted from the 20th century into the 21st century, exerting profound impacts on the lives of African American landowners and their descendants. While we can only speculate about what might have transpired if all that land had not been stolen, it is evident that the financial futures of African Americans could have diverged significantly. The history of black land theft underscores the importance of probing these questions, as it wasn't solely government institutions, but also individuals with wealth who knew how to exploit the laws for their gain. These rules and laws allowed white individuals to not only confiscate land, but also enrich themselves once they acquired it. Because this extensive theft transpired through countless small transactions over decades, it became easy for many to turn a blind eye to the injustices. Today, although black land theft may not be as overt, it is vital to investigate what thousands of these small financial transactions collectively amount to, especially in a nation founded on slavery, as doing so positions us to recognize and counter future wealth extraction schemes that could persist for decades. In a country where the racial wealth divide continues to worsen, we cannot afford to ignore these questions. Black land theft transpired from the 20th century into the 21st century, and left a lasting imprint on the lives of African American landowners and their descendants. We may never know how different things could have been if this land had not been stolen, but it is clear that the financial prospects of African Americans could have been markedly different. As always, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share our content to raise awareness about these important aspects of African American history and narratives. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your support.